Well, it's another Tuesday in another week of another year here on planet Earth, which means Dr. Brad Tucker is standing by to bring us all the latest science and space news, proving that we're not just about Star Trek.
With Dr. Brad Tucker and Matt Miller, this is Talkin' Science on Trekzone.
Well, welcome to Tuesday, Brad. We're talking science, and how you been the last week?
Oh, pretty good. It's another busy week in space. It's finally nice and warm here in Canberra. I think we're finally at the temperatures Brisbane gets in July, in the middle of winter. But you can't win them all.
It has been balmy, and I think we're getting up to 37 degrees on the weekend.
Oh, good Lord! We got 27.
Wow!
I know. Heat wave. Yeah.
Oh goodness. Hey, let's dive straight into the news. And the first all-female spacewalk was carried out on the weekend.
Yeah, and it finally happened. There was originally talk about trying to do this a couple months ago, and it didn't happen. And so on the weekend, for the first time, 2 female astronauts did a spacewalk. And so what they were doing last weekend during a spacewalk, during the same time when Alexei Leonov died, as we talked about, they installed a new battery unit for their solar arrays. It didn't really take it in charge, so they did another spacewalk to essentially try and fix it, which they successfully did, and they spent about, I think, just over 7 hours on their spacewalk. But it happened to be, for the first time, 2 female astronauts doing a spacewalk at the same time.
It's pretty incredible, given that, last week, as you mentioned, we were talking about Alexei being the first human to spacewalk, and finally, all these decades later, we've, it's an all-female crew fixing up and the International Space Station.
Yeah, there's only been now 14 women who have done spacewalks, with the first one occurring in 1984, I think it was. And it's good just to see how things are progressing, and it's needed. The space is definitely changing. We need more people doing it, a range of skill sets and genders and cultures. As we talked about with the first UAE astronaut going into space a few weeks ago. So it's nice that things are finally catching up and being representative of a diverse group with a diverse skill set.
One thing that I love, and you mentioned 14 women have carried out a spacewalk. 213 men have done the same thing. And funnily enough, it was a Russian cosmonaut that was the first female out in space in 1984.
That's right. It's Russia always seems to beat the U.S. on everything.
well, let's hope that they come up with another space race and it's getting to Mars.
Yeah, that might be good. Well, there is this space race, not just between Russia, but also, with China and Europe. So, and it is important to make sure that there are other people doing it instead of 30 to 50-year-old white American Air Force pilots.
Ah, yes, where it all began, but where it doesn't need to stay, some might say.
Exactly.
Get exclusive access to podcast and behind-the-scenes info by becoming a member on Patreon today. Supporting Australia's unofficial home of Star Trek gets even better, with membership starting at just $1 per month. Jump over to patreon.com/TrekZoneOrg.au.
Well, those women obviously were using spacesuits that were designed a little while ago, but NASA's come up with a new design for the 2024 Artemis missions to the moon.
Well, and it was partially highlighted from the first attempt at the first female spacewalk. When they tried to do this a few months ago, it didn't happen because currently spacesuits have 3 generic sizes, a small, medium, and large. As comical as that sounds, that's what it is. And a few months ago, they both needed a medium, and there was one medium, so they're like, oh, our historic all-female spacewalk can't happen because we don't have spacesuits that fit. And besides kind of being a snafu, it highlights a real problem. Just, they've only been made generically, again, partially because the astronauts in the past came from a fairly similar size and shape profile. They were limited in height and all these sorts of things, but it actually poses a big problem. So the human body changes in space, and that's because there's gravity and pressure, or lack of gravity, lack of pressure, and so your body can become larger or bigger, or your head become bigger. So it's kind of hard to predict how you're going to change in space. And so if you have these generic ill-fitting sizes, you might not fit properly. So this new generation of spacesuit for, as you said, the Artemis mission will have not only more customizable sizes, both for men and women, but slightly interchangeable parts. So let's say your head gets bigger, because your head does get bigger in space, they can account for that.
It's incredible, and they're looking at doing a 3D full body scan while performing motions that they would be expected to carry out during spacewalks to really customize those suits and make them personal, as it were.
Yeah, because the last thing you want is performance issues, and that's kind of what these big, bulky spacesuits do. You're moving around in awkward movements in a terrible environment because of the changes in gravity and pressure. And so it already makes it harder to do. So when you have something that fits even, poorly, it makes it all the more dangerous. In fact, it is a danger. A good example is, so when they're in the buoyancy lab in the big water pool tank in Johnson Space Center practicing using these things, well, in the water, the buoyancy causes it to feel like microgravity, so it's fine. But when you pop out, those things weigh, over 100 kilos. Some weigh 150, 180 kilos. Now, when you start moving, it feels like 180 kilos. Astronauts have a high rate of shoulder reconstruction surgeries because they fit so poorly, they tear their shoulders. So it is a real, actual big problem of these ill-fitted spacesuits.
It's incredible. And one thing we haven't mentioned is the name, Exploration Extravehicular Mobility Unit, or the XEMU. It's another one of these things of space people coming up with acronyms, isn't it?
True, but all I heard was extra emu in there, which means it's a purely Australian design, I think.
You are an Aussie now, Brad. I love it.
That's right.
Hey, it is brilliant. And another thing that I was reading as well is that they're going to be entering these suits from the rear of the suit, and it's not a new design for spacesuits because, you guessed it, the Russians came up with that.
Again, yeah, because currently the U.S. spacesuits, they kind of have to be lowered into their legs, and then the top comes over. And again, if these things are heavy and bulky, it makes it hard. By going in the back, again, it makes it all a little bit easier. It's going back to, we now have 50-ish plus years of spaceflight data. We can understand what are the best ways and best movements of doing this. And something as simple as what you wear is finally being addressed, which has been needed for space exploration, especially in the moon missions when they might be doing a number of maneuvers back and down to the surface with changing gravities and pressures and environments. The last thing you want is your clothes to fit poorly and you get hurt.
Well, on the topic of spacesuits, very briefly, Virgin Galactic has come out with their line of space tourist suits.
Yeah, and it looks like activewear. So they partnered
Yes.
with Under Armour to fit, again, more custom designed wear for the space tourist. Now, different from all these spacesuits we were just talking about is these aren't pressurized. These are not like the big spacesuits you see. These are more comfortable, like jumpsuit wears for, as you would see for some, airplane pilots or something like that. Now, that's fine because the cabin they will be in will be pressurized. What I immediately noticed, though, is if there is an issue, it is not pressurized. And if something happens, it might go terrible. So it's an interesting design and an interesting choice about what they made.
I get the feeling that the $250,000 per person ticket for a flight would also include some sort of waiver and indemnity clause.
I would imagine so, but and I think this is highlighting the things of what's going to happen with space tourism. You see what NASA has to go through, and yes, the accidents are limited, but how do we start thinking about these problems in the future that will arise at some point? And how do we deal with those problems that will arise at some point?
New content is being added all the time to Trekzone's YouTube channel. Talking Science with Dr. Brad Tucker on Tuesdays, Trekzone Live on Thursdays, and a Trekzone Conversation on Saturdays. Don't miss a moment. Subscribe and ring the bell to get fresh public releases.
Alrighty, let's move on to the satellites in orbit around the Earth. There's quite a lot of them, and there's quite a lot of them that fail or malfunction, and as yet there hasn't been been a way to repair them, but next year a couple of space missions are looking at addressing that very real problem.
Yeah, we have over 1,000 inactive or broken satellites in orbit. And we're talking about huge satellites. There's hundreds of thousands of smaller bits, but a big chunky satellites that are just broken. There's over 1,000. I think it could be as many as 2,500. What do these things do? Well, if you can't control them and they crash into things, they break it apart and create more things. They pose a real problem. And we saw this come to light in February 2009, where a Russian Cosmos satellite, a communication satellite, it died. They lost control of it. It crashed into Iridium satellite phone, broke apart. So it is a real danger. And as you said, a long-term goal has been, can we fix things in orbit? The space shuttle was really successful for being able to do things in very low Earth orbit, like the Hubble Space Telescope, and upgrade it and keep it alive. What about some of those other satellites? Because usually it's just fuel. You run out of fuel, so you have no thruster, so you can't control it. And so something as a refueling mission can go a long way in not only limiting the space junk problem, but keeping the satellite's life longer and therefore cheaper, because we're not having to replace them as often.
And it helps just with everything, and I guess bringing the cost of these satellites down over their lifetime as well.
That's right, because instead of having to build 2 5-year satellites because you run out of fuel, you just keep the same satellite alive for 10 years. It will make it much cheaper in the long term and make it safer. So this has been a pipe dream, and as you said, 2 new missions will be tested next year to really test this concept and see, can you lock a satellite, hold it, grab it, and do something to it. And if that turns out to be right, then the era of satellite repairmen and women and astronauts are here.
You can get social with Trekzone. Australia's unofficial home of Star Trek is everywhere you are. Get the wrap-up on our Facebook page. Keep in the loop on Twitter and relive Trek episodes on Instagram. Just search for Trekzone.
On the topic of satellites and fixing them up and not having so much space junk up there, Elon Musk has come out with SpaceX and said, well, we want to put 40,000 satellites in orbit.
So we talked about the beginnings of this a few months ago when they launched the first 1,200 Starlink satellites. So these are Starlink's this program that Elon Musk wants to have for satellite communication, and by having so many of them, almost global communication everywhere. And they just put in an application to launch 30,000 more on top of the 10,000 that's already been approved, as you said, bringing it to 40,000. That's a lot of satellites. That's, I think, somewhere between 5 and 6 times the amount of satellites total we have launched in the history of this planet. Now, we are launching more and more satellites, but 40,000 is a lot.
That's a significant amount.
It is. And, with it comes all of the issues of more broken satellites. And, this is just a problem for any satellites. Things break just as cars, space junk. The issues we saw with the first launch of Starlink, where when you have this train of satellites and they're reflecting sunlight, they cause light pollution because, we see them from the ground. They're trying to address it by making them dark, which is, potentially possible and will help. But it really is an interesting thing, both technically, safety, and kind of politically, right? I do hope Starlinks and things like global satellite communications work because it'll make life better on this planet. But, you can see monopolies happen quite quickly.
Exactly right. Well, they're going to be positioned between 330 and 580 kilometres above the Earth. So there is a little bit of atmosphere still there to be able to drag them down if required, to stop.
Yeah, but that's where crowded space is as well, right? That's where everything else is. And it makes it interesting.
And of course you have to look at that. I mean, you say, well, there's it's not necessarily a space junk problem, but it could be a launch and re-entry problem for our future manned crewed missions to the moon and to Mars as well. So lots of things to consider. 40,000 satellites in orbit is an interesting challenge to address.
Yeah, and one that does need to be addressed. And one that needs to be, thought of properly. Not that it has to be a bad thing, right? And we don't want to, I'm not trying to make it much as a bad thing, but as space changes, we need to just sometimes ask all of the questions.
Exactly right, Brad. Thank you very much for talking science, as you do every Tuesday, and we'll catch you next week.
Thanks, Matt.